Well, hello everyone. So it looks like we are getting 3.0 early for real. So instead of doing something like, say, moving Wehttam over to the Lana patch, they instead just combine two patches together. So that makes for a pretty crazy patch here. I'm not going to waste any time. Let's just jump right into it. So first I'm just going to go over real quick the predictions for this month. As always, these predictions are not 100%, and I guess the fact that this patch even exists should be an indicator of that. But I think it's relatively safe to assume that aside from combining the two patch cycles and removing a bunch of the banners that were supposed to come with the Lana month, they're going to go as they usually go and mostly follow the Chinese server. So what we know for the first week here is that not only are they releasing Wehttam and Werner and Mariandel, but they are also releasing this Build-A-Banner that was meant for the Lana patch, the Oath Sworn Summon. If you are a longtime player, you probably already know that you should be going for Wehttam. So because we have in effect jumped ahead a month, we can no longer use the Chinese server to tell us when the newest characters are going to be rerun, at least for the foreseeable future. But I think most PvP focused players will be trying to get Werner at least. Mariandel is sort of a bonus if you can get her. I think she's pretty good, but she's definitely more niche than Werner. The Build-A-Banner I think is pretty obvious. Like if you have some kind of missing Bond character or some character you're missing that you really want to build, then you should pull on that. And just to recap real quick, the Build-A-Banner, you get to refresh it up to twice, so you can have 3 different sets of characters on it. You choose 2 characters that come from any patch up to the Toa and Patsyr patch. So there's a fair number of characters missing from it. You know, there's no Autocrado, there's no Lucretia. Epsilon, Mu, Christiane, and Suzette are all not there. So just some quick advice to newer players. I would highly recommend that you pull for Wehttam. Not only is Wehttam just a really good unit, but his bonds really aren't that hard to get. They are 2 characters that you are likely to be obtaining down the line for other bonds anyway. He's pretty easy to fit into any faction team. And that's without mentioning the fact that he's in Protagonist, which of course is easy for newer players and any low budget players. As for the Oathsworn summon, and I think this applies to basically everyone, I would not waste your tickets on this trying to get characters that are run very often. And that includes characters like Leon or Bernhard or, you know, like Layden, Elwyn. Those characters are run really often, so it's kind of a waste to use your tickets here instead of on characters that we don't know are going to be run very often. So in my opinion, the characters that are not run very often that you can consider pulling on the Oathsworn summon for, the number 1 choice in my opinion, and I don't think a lot of people would disagree with me, is Rozalia. So in case you're new to the game, Rozalia is a very, very powerful healer, and she's an Empire faction buffer. She's just a really great unit to have. The biggest downside of Rozalia is that her bonds are kind of hard to get, especially Clotaire, who is also on the Oathsworn banner, so you can just try to get Clotaire here as well. Her other bond unlock is Lanford, who also doesn't get run that often. I mean, he does get run once in a while, but certainly more than Clotaire. But I can see somebody using the Oathsworn summon to get Lanford if they're in a rush to bond their Rosen. But I would say the Clotaire bond is way more important because he's the one who gives Rosen her attack bond. The other character I would maybe recommend is Florentia. If you don't have Florentia, then I think she might be worth getting on this banner. Her bonds are actually even harder to get than Rosen's in my opinion. Tsubame is barely ever run, and Licorice doesn't get rerun that often either. But Florentia is very essential for a number of PvE strategies. She is especially powerful in Dimensional Expedition, and of course she is one of the core healers in PvP right now, so Florentia is also a character I think would be worth on this banner. Aside from that, the only characters I can think to maybe pull for on this banner are Akka. If you are someone who really likes playing rush strategies, then maybe you want to get Akka here. Especially considering how we just skipped over an Akka banner because of the skipped Lana patch cycle. I can see some people pulling for Brenda on this banner because Brenda is required for a number of key bonds and PvP characters like Helena, and in the future she'll be needed for a Console of the Moons bond as well, so if you really think you need Brenda, I can see justifying that. And since we got Werner and Mariandel here, I can see justifying trying to get Claret here. Claret is required for Werner's bond, and similarly, Sage of the Trees is required for one of Mariandel's bonds. But I would actually say both of these are also relatively low priority compared to some of the other things you can get here. Claret gets run on like Meteor Strike and Princess Destiny banners once in a while, and Sage of the Trees doesn't get run that often either, but Mariandel isn't as important as Werner to many players, I think. So to put a TLDR on what I just said, the 2 main characters I would try to get from this Oathsworn summon if you really need them are Rozenseal and maybe Florentia and any of their associated bonds. And aside from that, try to pull for some characters that you feel like you might need the bonds for. But yeah, in general, we just have way too much going on this month, and just remember to budget your vouchers appropriately. Once again, whether you're a new player or a long-time player, you should try to get Wehttam because he is a limited character. We don't know if he's going to be rerun. If you are a PvP player, you can try to get Werner and Mariandel if you think they are important to your strategy. If you are a newer player, I would not recommend getting Werner and Mariandel at all. And finally, for the Oathsworn summon, get Rozenseal if you don't have her, maybe get Florentia if you don't have her, and get whatever bond characters you think you might need. Honestly, I know a number of players who think just going for Wehttam is going to dry up all their vouchers, so just be careful. Now for week 2, I fully expect us to get SP Lana. There is no reason to assume that we won't be getting her. We should also be getting a Ares plus Lucretia banner. This banner will be important for players like myself who did not pull for Lucretia when she first came out, assuming you actually want Lucretia, which most players do. Ares is pretty important for a number of Tensei bonds as well, but Ares gets run on Destiny banners decently often. So if you need Ares, unless you're in some very specific hurry, I wouldn't try to get Ares here. I just mentioned SP Lana, of course, but of course remember that if you want SP Lana, it does cost 4,000 crystals, or up to 4,000 crystals, around that amount, to get the Heart of Desire. So remember to ration that out if you want to get SP Lana early. Now remember that the SP Heart of Desires, this lottery is run every single month. So if you think there's a lot of stuff you want to pull for and you don't think SP Lana is a top priority for you, then feel free to skip getting SP Lana this month. It's not, it's okay. She's going to get rerun. Week 3 is the first time Autocrato is going to be on a Destiny banner, and, it's there for collection purposes if you really want him. And Maya is kind of important for a number of Tensei bonds as well. So, this is a important Destiny banner if you have a lot of Tensei character bonds you need still, but I don't think most people who are building Tensei teams at this point are having trouble with that. And week 4 is when Kruger is going to get run on a Destiny banner, which is kind of nice. And like I said, with the Oathsworn summon, this is a Bernhardt, Elwyn, Leon banner, and this is a banner that has been run multiple times. So once again, characters like this, like Bernhardt, Elwyn, Leon, Liana, Tiaris, Juggler, Landius, these characters get run so often. Don't waste them. Don't waste your Oathsworn summon trying to get them. And of course, we also have this Macho Lotto. If you want to spend the crystals to get this Toa skin, then just know that you need to save the crystals for that. So yeah, that's what we have predicted for this month. Definitely a lot of things to pull for, but once again, the priority for I think every player should be Wehttam. So with that being said, I'm going to jump into just talking about the characters very quickly. Let's talk about Wehttam. So Wehttam is a DPS unit. He is Demon and Flyer class. Generally speaking, people run him in his Flyer class. There's not much reason to be running him in his Demon class. His Demon class can use Balance Blade, but because it is a Demon class, it can't use Apex Boots, so you can't really make up for the lost movement or range that well. And even though his 3C does make up for his Demon weakness a slight bit, it's still not really worth it. It doesn't even have higher attack than his Flyer class, so there's really no reason. And of course, even in terms of tankiness, his Flyer class can wear Last Rites, which makes a pretty big difference. So the reason this guy is so important is because he is just kind of ridiculous. He is both good at single target and AoE. In single target, he can kill tanks, and that's because he has a 2C skill that's basically Sword Soul, except instead of doing heal block, it does Curse of Wounding, undispellable for 2 turns. A lot of tanks now run Blood Pact to stop Sword Soul from working, and I think that's kind of self-explanatory. I don't think most people run Heart of Gaia on their tank because it's not that good of an accessory, and attack plus defense as the flat stats on that piece is pretty bad. So generally speaking, Wehttam is pretty good at busting tanks. So on the other hand, he is good at AoEs because the one AoE that he has in 2C is it's a 2-block AoE around himself that does heal block and guard disable for 2 turns. It is dispellable, but it does last 2 turns, which is a pretty big deal. I mean, people who open an AoE strat with Bernhardt or something where you heal block them first already know opening with a heal block is very strong. So in AoE, Wehttam does have a couple downsides though. First is, like I said, this AoE is only 2 blocks wide around himself, which is pretty small. And the other thing is that Wehttam's stat boost from his talent, the attack and damage dealt increase, those are both in battle. So his AoEs don't get powered up by his talent, so the AoE itself is not that strong. Wehttam does have very high attack, so he'll still do pretty good damage, and you know, he can do 2 AoEs in a row with his 3C plus this AoE, and you can even equip Scarlet Reaper on him if you really wanted to. So it's not the worst. I mean, he can still do pretty decent AoE damage, but it's not being boosted by his talent. So speaking of his 3C is also very strong. It creates a summon after doing an AoE, which has a number of functions. First, it increases the stats of all Dark Faction units, obviously including himself. So he fits well into Dark Boxes for that reason, of course. It is an AoE attack, as I said. He can drop the sword up to 2 spaces away from him, and the sword attacks 3 spaces around himself. So essentially, the sword has a 4-block range out from Wehttam himself, because you drop the sword 2 blocks away from Wehttam, and then there is a AoE 3 blocks around the sword. So this means on a flyer Wehttam, he has 5 move, and he can shoot the sword up to 4 spaces away, and then he can act again after that because of that's what the 3C does. So he actually has a 9 space threat range, because after you drop the sword, it means you've damaged an opponent, so you can combine that with his 1C teleport, which allows him to teleport next to an enemy with less than 100% life. The teleport allows him to act again if his talent debuff or the sword is near him. So since you just dropped the sword, of course he gets to act again after the teleport, and then he gets to move his entire 5 spaces again to do whatever shenanigans you need to do. And of course, while doing this, the 3C also gave him an attack buff. So all this is to say that Wehttam works in PvP because he has a pretty big threat range, not the largest in the game. I mean, there are characters with larger threat ranges than him, but I would say that's above average for sure. And as for PvE stuff, you know, he has like such a good selection of PvE friendly skills like lightning and air slash. In general, he's just like a very good DPS to have around, and he's also very tanky when the sword is active. I would say one of the biggest weaknesses of Wehttam is actually his soldiers. He does have werewolves, which are of course very, very strong, but obviously if you run into holy units, it can be a problem, even with this 3C helping him out a little bit on that side. So if you're in a situation where you can't use werewolves effectively, he has to fall back on either vampire bats or gargoyles, neither of which are bad, but they are not the strongest flyer soldiers around. Obviously there are like steel wings, and later on we're going to get like the mechanical dragon knights, and he doesn't get any of those. So aside from werewolves, his soldier choices are just okay. For PvE, of course, like vampire bats are very good. But overall, like I said, Wehttam, you know, huge range, can kill tanks, can AoE, good at PvE. There's really no reason to not get him, especially considering how he is a limited character and we don't know if he's ever going to get rerun. So next is Werner. You know, they renamed the Tensei Werner into Werner Deem at some point so that they can differentiate the two. Personally, I'm happy about this. I really didn't like that Sigma was being called Werner like he's some kind of secondary character, because he was the first Werner in the franchise. But anyway, silly things like that aside, Werner is another character I know a lot of people are going to be pulling for. Like I said, PvE focused players or like newer players probably don't need to worry too much about getting Werner. I will say that Werner actually fits pretty well into PvE teams because he has Glory Faction, which is very easy to buff for any sort of newer player or PvE focused player. But as I mentioned earlier, Werner's bonds are kind of hard to come by. So Werner is another assassin unit, but he comes with his own gimmicks. He has an offensive and a defensive form provided by his talent. When he ends his turn without attacking, he gets to choose either an offensive or a defensive form. So the offensive form allows him to pierce guard, and it increases his skill range and it increases his attacking damage, while the defensive form increases his counter damage and allows him to heal after every time he's been attacked. So this is really the main core mechanic of Werner. For the purposes of PvP, the most important thing to know about these two forms is that you cannot differentiate them from the tooltip. So when he uses it in PvP, you just see him do an animation, and if you click on him, it'll just say like, oh, Werner is in a special stance right now. So obviously in PvP, this means you can play all kinds of mind games with him. You can make him stand by himself, and then make your opponent think he's in the counter stance when in fact you are playing aggressively. Basically, this just makes it so that people are kind of scared of attacking Werner, but at the same time, you can't afford to leave him alone because he might pierce guard and come kill one of your units. Now, one of the big downsides of Werner is that his threat range is lower than the majority of assassins that got introduced to the game, at least without extra assistance from some other sources. Basically, if you want to maximize Werner's range, you need to run him as infantry class and then use Apex boots. Now, this might seem like a problem, especially given that there's a number of very strong cavalry units running around the game, for example, Lana Elwyn are still around sometimes. Sometimes people run Leon. But Werner has a couple ways to deal with that. First, he does have the new State Guard troops. Not only are those troops really strong offensively, but obviously defensively they can protect Werner from cavalry units. And they even have enhanced counter damage, which can stack with Werner's own counter stance. And that can help protect him a lot against cavalry units that try to charge in and kill Werner. And I didn't mention this yet, but his counter stance actually can allow him to counter ranged attacks up to any range. So just like Emilia's exclusive, basically, except even better. So basically, like any long-range mages like Lucretia or Light of Genesis aren't a safe counter against him either. And as for going on the offense, if he's on infantry class, it still isn't a big deal because his 3C can ignore class effects when used. So if you need Werner to assassinate a cavalry unit, you just use his 3C and he'll do neutral damage to them and probably kill them. So overall, Werner is just a really strong assassin that fits pretty well into the current meta because it's a very aggressive meta. He can protect himself against enemy assassins by countering for a lot of damage. He can counter the multitude of long-range mages that are in the meta right now. He has the flexibility in his soldiers to protect himself from a number of threats in the meta, and he has pretty decent survivability compared to a lot of other DPSs. His range is not the highest, but it is good enough to be threatening. And the final thing is that Werner fits pretty well into a number of boxes in the current meta. Elwyn is still decently common. Elwyn is going to get his 3C pretty soon. Zerda isn't run super often anymore, but Epsilon is going to get his time in the day very soon. So Meteor Strike buff is also pretty easy for him to get. Landius isn't super common anymore, but in boxes that use a lot of legend characters, it's still easy to pick Landius and then get a bunch of legend DPS. I will say that Werner isn't as universal as Wehttam is because Werner cannot buff himself with an attack buff. He does prefer to have somebody there buffing him. And he's not even like, base Sigma. Normal Sigma, he can use his helm to get an attack buff, and of course, normal Sigma is also a faction buffer. So this is why you don't see Werner in every single box. Some boxes just, Werner just doesn't synergize well into, whereas Wehttam can fit in basically any box. But aside from that, Werner, pretty good PvP unit. I think a lot of people are going to be pulling for this guy. So finally, we have Mariandel. The easiest way to summarize Mariandel is that she is basically like a combination of Rachel and Lambda. Both of these characters have kind of fallen out of favor. Rachel still gets used in PvE fairly often. She's still pretty good there. But she doesn't have the movement range to be an effective threat. And Lambda has okay range, but she's just so frail. She needs to stand next to people. She is, generally speaking, not picked over other AoE units. So here comes Mariandel, who kind of combines the features of both of them. She has the increased AoE span and range like Lambda has, but she also heals people around her when she uses skills, kind of like Rachel does. Mariandel can also do both AoE and single target, just like Rachel can, whereas Lambda could only do AoE. So Mariandel is a pretty versatile unit. She actually has bigger range than Lambda if you stack her up enough, because from her talent she does get mana stacks, which increase her intelligence and skill damage, and then her 3C has a passive that increases her skill span and range. Up to +2, which actually makes it larger than Lambda's AoEs. The downside, of course, is that Mariandel needs people around her using skills in order to charge up her stacks. So even though Mariandel has actually pretty decent range thanks to her increased AoE span, the fact that she does need to charge up using other people's skills does make her slower than a number of other characters in the game. It does make Mariandel pretty decent in a tank push setting. She both attacks and heals at the same time, just like Rachel does, but without as many range restrictions that Rachel has. But just like most mage or holy units, she is very, very frail. She is not as frail as Lambda, who is just insanely frail and dies to everything, but she's still pretty frail, and she doesn't really have anything to compensate for that. Lucretia had a revive, and she does not. Light of Genesis has the option to stay far from the action and teleport herself in when she needs to. Mariandel can't really do any of that. She's a more straightforward character, which is probably why much of the community hasn't seen her get as much play as Werner or Wehttam, or even like her fellow mages like Lucretia, Light of Genesis, or even Lana. That being said, Mariandel isn't bad or anything, it's just that you need to know what she's good at before you use her. She also fits fairly well into the current meta because she does have Princess Faction, which is a faction with all kinds of mages in it right now and lots of AoE. Same thing with Mythical Faction, quite a few AoE mages in that faction, and Mariandel works well with all of them. And of course, anybody who's pulling for Werner will probably want to pull for Mariandel as well, because one of Werner's bonds is Mariandel. And At the same time, one of Mariandel's bonds is Werner, so you do kind of want to have them both if you pull on this banner. And this is a pretty minor thing, but Liza also needs Mariandel for one of her bonds. So if you're interested in playing around with Liza, you might want to get Mariandel as well. Yeah, Zalone just trying to get all our money here. So finally, I'll talk real quick about SP Lana. So the most significant change from the normal Lana to SP Lana is the fact that her talent now also applies to AoEs. So most of the time when you see SP Lana being played on a Chinese server, it is in the setting of AoE. That's not to say that SP Lana is not also good at single target, she's really good at that as well. But for a lot of players, AoE is just easier to play, and SP Lana does quite well at that. Just like before, she still has the increased range on her AoE attack range, but she still also has an increased AoE span now as well. And this is only if you bring a melee soldier along with her, which is usually her new soldier, which is Redeemer, which gives her a conditional revive. It's definitely hard to maintain sometimes, but it is nice when you can get it. One of the big annoyances with SP Lana, and some would say this is actually a downgrade from the original Lana, is the fact that her talent is based off of how many buffs she has now. So she is very, very reliant on getting a faction buff in order to do maximum damage. Because just giving her a mass attack or something will only give her like, 7 or 14% damage or something like that. Gospel will give her 3 buffs, and her talent maxes out at 5 buffs. I mean, there are a number of ways you can try to get to those 5 buffs without a faction buff, but generally speaking, the easiest way to get there is with the faction buff. As far as her new skills go, her 1C that randomly reduces cooldowns is definitely the one you want to take all the time. Not only does it allow her to spam cast single target attack skills like Light of Genesis can, in AoE, it usually allows her to cast them pretty continuously if you take this skill plus 2 AoEs. You might get unlucky and you only get CD-1 on both of them. But honestly, most of the time Lana does so much damage that you probably shouldn't need more than 2 shots to start killing the enemy team unless you pick ban very poorly. Her new 2C skill is a weird skill that I think is nothing but a gimmick. I do think there are situations where you can use it, but generally speaking, it's kind of easy to disable Lana after she's teleported forward if your enemy has any sort of aggressive unit. It is true that it reduces the amount of damage she takes, and she can be pretty hard to kill when she has this up, but some units can just kill her anyway. For example, I've seen replays where Lucretia just kills her anyway because her 3C is effective on holy units. And barring that, you can also do things like cast all kinds of debuffs on her because this teleport does not give her immunity or anything like that. It's not a useless skill, it's just that usually it takes more setup than is worth putting into it. So overall, SP Lana is definitely an upgrade over the original Lana, except for like Ancient Beckoning, where she's actually worse. Princess faction is doing pretty good right now, and that helps Lana out a bit. And the Dark faction buffers, like at least Bolzel is still around most of the time. Liko isn't used as much. But her factions are not the worst right now. Her factions used to be a really big problem for her. And I think she fits best into AoE boxes. Even though on paper she is one of the strongest single target mages in the game, I do think she is more effective with spamming AoEs alongside, her typical buffers like Shelfanail and Luna. Even Bolzel, who is of course AoE focused. Just remember, it's going to cost you a lot of crystals to get SP Lana if you want her from the lottery. So once again, if you're not in a hurry to get SP Lana, you can wait until next month to get her. So since they combined 2 patches together, we are getting 5 new 3Cs in addition to the 3Cs that come with the new characters. I'm just going to run through all of them real quick because most of them really, I don't have much to say about them. Varna's 3C is pretty much just a better 1,000 arrows. There's really not a lot to say here. Varna continues to be one of the best SR units in the game. Probably the best one in PvP. So she really didn't need much of an upgrade because she was already relevant. So there's really not much to say about this other than the fact that it makes her slightly better. Oliver's is a huge disappointment. It's really just like a slightly better plunder, basically. It really sucks that they didn't come up with something better than this because this is the last upgrade that Oliver is going to get, at least for a while. So next we have Melania's 3C. This one's a little bit more interesting. I think it'll have some niche use in PvE strategies because now Melania no longer needs to be guarded herself to do some interesting effects on the tank. She can increase people's stats if they guard and also give them a regeneration effect. So I can see this being useful in a number of PvE challenge maps. If nothing else, they at least gave Melania something unique. And the active portion of this is basically just like a bigger mass heal, basically, which is definitely nice. Melania needed that. One downside I will say here is that Melania, because of her kit, she kind of liked running both her Guardian skill and Gospel at the same time, and she can't do that with the 3C. But there's really nothing you can do about that. That's just like how the game has been set up. getting something that might be useful in a gimmick strategy, I think, was pretty much the best outcome that Melania could have asked for. Tiaris is, I think everybody already knows about it. Like, it's just a very strong skill for aggressive strategies in PvP. It's an AoE attack buff and an attack blessing buff, and also includes a reflect damage reduction, just for shits and giggles, I guess. It does give the attack down immunity, but it does not give silence immunity like mass attack does, which I think is a really big loss when compared to using mass attack, but nothing you can do about that. The other big problem I have with this is just the fact that it only lasts 2 turns. So basically, when you use this skill, you gotta be sure you are all lined up and you are ready to commit to your strategy, because 2 turns is like nothing in PvP sometimes, and if you do not make those 2 turns count, this is on 9 cooldown, you're not going to get it back up again. I don't think this is any good in PvE. I can't think of any strategies that would prefer a skill that has this long of a cooldown, because most PvE fights are marathon style fights where you need to outlast a boss who has a massive HP bar and you need to do consistent damage over multiple turns. I mean, sometimes there are burn down strategies, which maybe there might be some situations where a Tiaris 3C would be good for those. But generally speaking, I think the fact that this is not good in PvE is not a problem, because Tiaris was already one of the best healers in PvE, so it's not a big deal. So finally, we have the original Queen healer, Liana, getting her 3C. The passive portion of this skill I don't think is really that useful. Aside from the fact that buff block exists, it's also the fact that if you are removing debuffs, you've probably already engaged your opponent, and in that case, the most powerful buff you could have gotten is a movement buff, and it's not as good anymore. I mean, buffs are always nice, obviously, so I'm not going to say this is useless, and I guess it's nice to annoy Kruger if he's around, but generally speaking, his passive is just a nice bonus on top of what Liana's talent usually did. The most important part of this, of course, is the active portion, which is basically just Gospel, which also gives immunity to Liana herself at the same time. So the big problem with this 3C is the fact that it has 3 cooldown, and the Gospel on the target still only lasts 2 turns, whereas the immunity for herself only lasts 1 turn. Now, both of these buffs, both the Gospel on the target and the immunity she gives herself, are affected by Juggler plushie, so you can extend the Gospel to 3 turns and the self-immunity to 2 turns, but because normal Gospel does have a cooldown of 2, you do need to keep that in mind when you're using Liana and you think you're doing some kind of slow tank push strategy. Basically, even if you have a teddy bear on Liana, it's once again important to know when to cast this skill. Instead of using it like Gospel was being used with teddy bear before, which is that, it's always up anyway, so it doesn't matter. Even with teddy bear, this skill is going to have a dead turn on the target, and on Liana herself, it's going to have 2 dead turns. So, if you get silenced, it's really bad. But aside from that, of course, having Gospel on 2 targets, I don't think I need to explain why that can be very good. But when it's all said and done, Liana's best skill is probably still Act Again. I guess they didn't want to give Liana a second Act Again, that would have been too broken. But yeah, pretty good skill, but it does have some downsides. Alright, next we have the 4 exclusives we're getting. Now, of course, since we actually skipped 1 month's worth of content, it is worth noting that we probably skipped over a fair number of challenge points that we could have earned in that month. Now, to be fair, it's not like we ever need to compete against Chinese server players, at least as far as we know. So if everybody loses out on getting some extra controllers, then everybody's still equal in terms of PvP. So that's not a big deal. But the fact that we are getting 4 exclusives in 1 month, without getting some more events to compensate, or even some free challenge points to compensate, I think even for day 1 players who have every controller up to this point, you might need to consider okay, there are some exclusive I just need to skip on. And for players who do not complete all the challenges, or you're late to the game, new to the game, and you don't know what to spend your challenge points on, you need to be even more attentive to what you spend your challenge points on now. With that being said, let's look at Rozalia's sword, which is definitely one of the swords I would say that you should skip on. This is not a bad weapon or anything. It is nice to have Rozalia be able to ignore terrain sometimes, but I think generally speaking, I don't think it changes that much about Rozalia. Sure, there are a couple PvP maps, like the bridge map or the lake map. All those are pretty annoying for Rozalia, and on those maps, this sword can be pretty strong. But in general, I don't think this is going to be much better than even something standard like Seal Guardian. Some Rozalias run Mjolnir for a Dispel, that can be very good. And of course, we're going to get that Bone Smasher hammer, the one that actually breaks chest pieces. I think that one is actually going to be significantly better for Rozalia compared to this sword. I mean, movement bonuses like this one where, you can ignore terrain, like that's always really strong. So if you think that's a regular problem for you when you're using Rozalia, then for sure you should get this sword. But otherwise, I think, sticking to Steel Guardian or something is just fine. Knight of Mysteries, on the other hand, is like pretty much a must-buy if you use Knight of Mystery. Aside from opening up her troop choices, you can use Steel Wings and Goblins a little bit more freely now. But the most important part of this is the fixed damage before battle. Now, last time I checked, this still applies to AoEs, which makes it very, very strong. It means you break last rites before striking them with whatever AoE that Knight of Mystery is using, which is Thunder Zone or her 3C, both of which have very big ranges. Really, the only problem with Knight of Mystery nowadays, I think, is her factions. Legend plus Strategic Masters is not the best faction combination. But regardless, if you like using Knight of Mystery, I would definitely get this weapon. There's not a lot of qualifiers for that. Patsyr's helm is one of those helms that I would say is technically the best thing you can wear on her. But there's 2 points to that. First of all, not that many people use Patsyr to begin with, so I think a lot of people are just going to skip this just based on that. And the second thing is that even though this does improve Patsyr's movement, which is one of her weaknesses, movement +1 probably isn't nearly enough to really fix her movement woes. The extra fatigue is definitely nice. It helps you get the stun from her talent a lot more reliably. So this is one of those tough ones where I would say, like, if you like using Patsyr, I would get this. And this is mostly referring to PvP, because I think even if you use Patsyr in PvE, especially like Fenrir, I don't think it's actually that valuable to get another stack of fatigue on Fenrir. Maybe somebody who is more experienced with Ancient Beckoning could school me on this, but I'm pretty sure with things are the way they are, if you use Patsyr on Fenrir, you probably have a well-established way of getting all the debuffs you need on Fenrir already, so you don't need this helm to give you that extra push. And in fact, you probably want to stick with Keen's Crown, because obviously Keen's Crown helps you get the damage you need to chase that high score. So finally we have Mariel's Hammer, which is pretty good. So offensively, this is not an improvement over any other hammer that Mariel could be using, especially, once again, considering that we're going to have that Bone Smasher hammer coming up that lets you break chess pieces. But it is actually pretty important if you like using Mariel as an off-healer, which people usually do. I mean, that's usually why you put Mariel in a box. The cooldown reduction effect on this hammer is a pretty big deal, because what it means is that you can cast God King Aegis, and then next turn you can immediately engage using Enduring Faith, and then use her 3C, and then God's King's Wrath will immediately be ready for use. Before this hammer, if you tried to do that, God King's Wrath would still be on 1 cooldown, and that would just ruin everything, because, you don't get the cooldown reduction from her 3C's buff and stuff like that. So generally speaking, if you find yourself casting God King's Aegis for a heal a lot of the time, then I think this hammer will be her best one. Mjolnir Dispel is nice, and, the Mimir's hammer that has damage on it sometimes, and of course there's the Bone Smasher hammer that's going to come later. I would say all of those are better than this one, a slight bit, in terms of offensive potential, especially the Bone Smasher hammer. But considering Mariel's typical role in a box, I would say this is her best hammer overall. Okay, so now we have the new soldiers. So as expected, like in the past, others and I have stated that when Zulum patches stuff into the global version of the game, they actually patch 2 patches worth of stuff at once. So they did the same thing this time. We're actually getting next month's soldiers, or what was meant for next month's soldiers, at the same time we're getting this month's soldiers, so that's why we're getting 4 soldiers at the same time. So first we have State Guard. These are pretty much an upgrade over Amazon Champions, although that's kind of an oversimplification, because most units that can use Amazons cannot also use State Guards, because for the most part, units that use Amazons are going to be sticking to those. But units that can use both, like Alpha, Brenda, Lanford, Lewin, and Shibaraku, pretty much all of them, I think, would prefer using State Guards over Amazons. State Guards have slightly better defensive stats, and I would say, generally speaking, they deal more damage. It really depends on what kind of target you're hitting. They also do extra counter damage, which can be very useful, as for Werner especially, like I mentioned earlier. Not much to say here. We kind of needed another strong DPS Lancer choice, because Hoplites weren't, quote-unquote, really a Lancer DPS choice. So State Guards are definitely a welcome change in that sense. So next we have Fighting Monk. So these guys are basically just a straight upgrade over Bishops. Pretty much the only unit here that uses Bishops regularly that did not get Fighting Monk is Licorice. I would say aside from that, every single one of these units here, in any situation where you were thinking of using Bishops, you would probably use Fighting Monk instead. There are a number of units here that can use Forest Priests, like Almeida and Wheeler. Obviously, if you're going for like a full healer focus, you should be using Forest Priest instead. But Fighting Monk is a pretty good, versatile soldier choice. If you are on Holy class, this is the first offensive Holy troop that we've gotten that is ranged. Because up until now, the only offensive Holy unit has been Zealots, and those are 1 range. But of course, these guys are limited in the fact that the hero needs to be Holy class in order to use them effectively. So I would say, like, out of these characters that regularly choose a Holy class, you know, the most common ones are probably going to be like Almeida, who uses Holy class because that's all she has. Liana is a maybe, like, so, you know, it depends on if you decided to class your Liana into Holy or Mage. Mariandel, you know, you can either choose to put her in Holy or Mage class, and, you know, if you're on Holy class, these are pretty nice to have. Sage of the Trees is usually on a Holy class, and these are really nice, especially if you want to kill a juggler with werewolves out front. And Sophia and Wheeler are also locked into Holy classes, so they can use these guys as well. So for the most part, I would say, like, most of these units are not offensive units, so you're not going to be seeing these being used offensively very often. But it is very nice that it makes your healer a little bit more troublesome to attack into, because, of course, like the description says, it will remove your melee range penalties when you are attacked. So at the very least, when your healers are getting melee attacked, you're going to counter for a little bit more damage than you typically do. And of course, all this is happening while these monks still give the same amount of healing as bishops do. And they're also tankier than bishops. So like I said, you know, any situation where you were thinking of using bishops, you should use Fighting Monk instead. Sandsea Mercenary is just a really strong infantry troop that is worth building. Nothing much to say there. If you're a big Alpha user, these are really nice to have. If you are a big Deedlit user, these are her best infantry soldier by far. Her best choice before this were heavy infantry. Estelle uses these quite well. Sakura uses these quite well because they are dual phase. If you are planning to use SP Lewin or Iron Chancellor, both of them really like this troop, so if you can't afford upgrading them yet, you should start saving right now. So finally we have Night Elf, which is like, it is like a side grade to Faceless, basically. They're good, it's just that there's really not much reason to be building these guys if you already have Faceless built, because pretty much all of these units can use Faceless, and in almost all situations where you feel like Night Elves would work, Faceless work just as well. Night Elves do more damage than Faceless, so if you really want to min-max your performance in certain situations, then yeah, go ahead and trade Night Elves. But I would put these pretty low priority because of how redundant they can be. Okay, so quick content summary. We have, you know, main story of Act 2 is wrapping up, and we have Act 3 story starting now. We are getting Frigg as a new Covenant. There's not a lot I want to say about that other than the fact that Frigg has lower HP and defense bonuses than Thor and higher intelligence bonus, and this matters because Covenants can be changed before you start a PvP match during unit placement. So it's not like you only choose one Covenant and you have to stick to that all the time. So if, for example, during pick ban you end up with Kyura as your main carry for your PvP match, then definitely you want to switch over to Frigg for your Covenant instead of Thor, assuming Frigg is properly upgraded, obviously. But yeah, they did design it in a way where it's not like you only raise one Covenant and you can be comfortable with that. I mean, you can be, but if you want to min-max, then you should be raising all the Covenants, so you know, raise Frigg if you have some pretty strong mages you want to beef up as well. We're getting Dimensional Expedition again, and thankfully they delayed it a week. We're not going to get it until the 30th, so you know, everybody gets to enjoy their Christmas. So last main thing here is the Farmville mode. It's honestly a pretty simple mode. You build 4 different resource type of buildings which generate resources over time. You just need to go into the mode and then click on the buildings to collect your resources. You use the resources to upgrade your buildings and to build new buildings. So there is a main castle which just determines the level cap on several of your buildings. You can upgrade your resource buildings to make them generate resources faster. You can get storage buildings to store the maximum amount of resources you're holding. You can build dormitories, and this is basically like your workers. You need to upgrade these so that you can build more buildings at once, and eventually you're going to need to upgrade them regardless, because as buildings get higher level, they require more and more builders to upgrade them at all. So you need to upgrade these, and once you're done upgrading a lot of those, you will be able to build both the shop and the Timeless Trial Sweeping building. These are the 2 buildings that actually have an effect on your gameplay that we're going to see this patch. So first we have the shop. You can see the left for the list of items you can buy. Most notably, you can get like 3C items here. You can get some Aniki materials here. You can get epic martial spirits. You can get the enchant scrolls. So all of these are very nice. So I would highly recommend that you pay a little bit of attention to the floating realm. Don't wake up in the middle of the night to collect resources and upgrade buildings right on time. Like it's not worth it, guys. But check it like once or twice a day, just like your expeditions. You check it around the same time. But anyway, as you level up the shop, you will get access to more and more of these items, and of course the enchant scrolls come at the end. And you are going to need your shop fully upgraded for the future weapon forge and farmland that we're going to get. So, don't fall behind too much if you care about that stuff. They are going to upgrade this over time, and it's going to max out at level 9, I believe, which means you can sweep all the way up until the very last level, which you need to play yourself, which I think is going to be really great. I mean, needing to do timeless trial every week was one of the most annoying things at this point in the game. Although, I don't mind needing to do the final stage because that one can still be slightly challenging sometimes. But yeah, this building is great just for saving a lot of time through the weeks. So definitely a nice building to upgrade. Okay, so I tried to keep things short, but this ended up being 40 minutes anyway. Thank you everyone for watching as always. Thank you all for all your support. As always, good luck with your polls. I think all of us are going to need some this time. But most importantly, enjoy your Christmas. I'll see you guys next time.